Usman is the founding partner of Umbrellium, a company that specializes in urban technology to empower communities. We're extremely proud to be Umbrellium's exclusive partner in Australia. And having Usman's expertise in digital architecture join our collective is really exciting, as it makes us truly unique offering to Australia. And it gives opportunities to create some really impactful outcomes in the cities and communities of the future. We're also working with him on a variety of projects outside of Australia as well. So all the way from London, welcome Usman.
Thank you very much, Vince, for that introduction, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'm really honored to be here. We've been working with Frost now for a couple of years, but this is the first time I have proof there's actually an office here, because we'd never actually met until, I think the first person that we met was Maria, just over the summer. Until then, all the work we'd done was remote. And so it's really nice to be here and to see everyone and to kind of put faces to names and discover they're three-dimensional and not all flat 2D faces. I am going to talk about engaging cities. I'm trained as an architect. My background is in architecture, and I would like to suggest that I'm still operating within the field of architecture. It is the discipline that I want to contribute to and to ideally transform. My team in London is quite small, but we have a very diverse range of projects. On the one hand, we'll get involved in designing and building interactive spaces. This is a project I'm going to talk about a little bit more later on, where we created a kind of an operating system for public space. On the other hand, sometimes we're building kind of apps and working on citizen-centric initiatives with city partners. Unlike many design offices, I think, we have a very high priority on kind of creating IP that can be used again. In other words, we're not just a consultancy kind of building on behalf of others. We're looking for ways to scale things up. And so one of the first spin-outs from the company was called Patch Bay. This is about 12 years ago. It was basically one of the world's largest IoT data platforms in its time. It was acquired, and it's now actually part of Google's IoT cloud. And then we get involved in these sort of large-scale participatory frameworks. This is another project I'm going to talk about a little bit, where we get sometimes thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people to do something all together and to sort of, even if only for one night, sort of change something about their city. But the way it all, and similarly, the clients that we work with are also quite diverse. In many cases, we'll work with cultural organizations, where we might be building something, an interactive experience, but something about that is applicable in cities, out in public spaces. And so we'll almost reuse some of the thinking to apply to public space. And then when we get involved with an airport, for example, they look at the stuff we've done in the city and say, well, actually, we're kind of a city, and what can you apply there? And what was really interesting was when we started working with Changi, it was because they had actually seen one of our art projects, and that sort of all kind of brought it back together. But again, we're constantly having to sort of hop from sector to sector, from delivery method to delivery method. What I wanted to start with, though, was this image, because this was actually the image that got me going, that made sense to me as a student of architecture in the early 90s. It's an image I found in a book called The Climatic Physiology of the Pig, which was not required reading in architecture school, but it was a very interesting book. And this image for me stunned me because it's the same piglets in the same box, but over here the temperature has been increased by 4 degrees. And I was really struck by this because this small change of the environmental conditions had dramatically altered the relationship that the occupants had to each other. And I realized that this is what I was interested in architecture. How could I kind of work with, if you like, the software of space and not just the physical hardware of space? And what is that interplay between the physical fabric and the sound, the light, the smell, the temperature, the electromagnetic fields, the social relationships, all this other stuff that goes together to actually define how we perceive and interact with space, but has kind of in the past not necessarily been thought of as core to architecture. And this has kind of led me to 3 kind of fundamental processes that I think has appeared again and again through all of my projects. The first is to think about architecture as perception and interaction. For me, the architecture really doesn't exist until there's somebody there perceiving with it and interacting with it and kind of bringing to life. There is no architecture without the people inside, or part of it, or in some way included in the design and understanding of that system. The second is this idea of building for now. So a lot of this kind of thinking came about, as I said, I was a student in the early 90s, and at that point, in order to really pursue an advanced agenda in architecture, it was typically done, you'd publish a book, or you'd have an exhibition, or you might build a model. You'd never actually build the thing itself. And this kind of frustrated me, because I think that architecture, again, being this thing all about perception and interaction, fundamentally had to be a thing that could be built. And the fact that technology has started to impact the way we interact with each other, the way we interact with our cities, means that we fundamentally need to be building stuff now and not just speculating about what might be here in 20 or 30 years or what have you. So that was something very core to my approach. And underpinning this all is this idea that technology is not just a thing. It's not just, an object. It's not just this physical thing. It's a set of processes that are very explicitly socio-political. Technology is given rise to in certain socio-political contexts and have certain socio-political outcomes. And so thinking about the technology, you need to be thinking about that wider context and the impact, and also the conditions that actually give rise to the creation of this technological framework in the first place. In kind of thinking this through, I think it becomes a bit obvious now to say that the city is about more than just buildings. The city is about more than just this kind of physical fabric. It is as much that as it is about all of this interaction, the conversation, and most importantly, the novelty, right? The city is, in a sense, our humanities, our most kind of creative engine for diversity. It's unlike every other engine that we've built that takes only finite inputs and has finite outputs. The city itself takes almost anything you throw at it and throws out unexpectedness. And so when you are working with something like technology that's really not very good at dealing with unexpectedness, you need to be able to embrace that kind of messiness, if you see what I mean. Because if you erase all of that messiness, if you erase or if you try and iron out all the seams, you're actually ironing out the things that make the city so valuable in the first place, because it's this kind of a location for creativity and diversity and unexpectedness. But the typical smart city paradigm really doesn't support this very well. If you look at the way that technology is typically, or at least over the last 10 or 15 years, has been discussed in the context of cities, it's been so much about efficiency and convenience and optimizing and solving problems and all these things that see the city as a problem, that you can define problems and you can solve them, which is, by the way, the business model of most technology companies, but is not the way that the city actually functions. If you throw anything that you consider a problem in the city, if you were to define it, you will find 100 other people that will define it in a completely different way. And they'll actually consider the root causes to be different. It's so difficult even to get agreement on that. And so when you're thinking about problems in the city, you need to think more about managing them than simply solving them with something you can drop in. And so the debate around the smart city is a little worrying to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, because who's familiar with Pruitt-Igoe here? I presume there's some architects in the audience. Hands, Pruitt-Igoe? One, okay. That's interesting. So Pruitt-Igoe is one of the classic examples of the high-rise development in the 60s. Now, what's interesting is the language that was used to sell this was identical to the way that data platforms are being sold in cities now. It's all about optimizing and security and efficiency and making things work seamlessly. That's what the high-rise was all about. That was the language that was used. And 10 years later, it was being knocked down. It was called the kind of epitome of all these things, but because of many, many different reasons, and there's sort of whole manuscripts devoted to this, but in large part because the people who were defining efficiency and convenience and all these other things, optimizing, were not the people who were actually living there, who had completely different ideas of how they wanted to interact with each other and what have you. And this is the real concern about bringing technology into the city, is if you think you can just parachute something in and it's going to solve everything for you, you will almost 99 times out of 100 find that you're dealing with the wrong thing, or you are trying to solve a problem that the people who are being impacted by actually might not even think is a problem. And so we've actually seen this in the smart city discourse evolve over time to deal with this. So there were the early adopters, there was Masdar, there was Songdo in Korea, there's the Plan IT initiative. All of these are sort of going back sort of 10, 15 years, were largely sold on, okay, this is a high-tech town or city or smart city or what have you. But if you look at them now, they have very little to show. I mean, they're basically bog standard, reasonably high-tech buildings. The thing that actually got people to move there was the tax breaks. Almost nobody went there because they were kind of attracted by, oh, this is going to be a great place to live. It was the tax breaks, and the governments had to introduce the tax breaks because it looked for a long time as though there weren't even going to be any people in this sort of fantastically new city. About sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago, a lot of people started talking about the smart citizen because they were sort of recognizing that, okay, we haven't really involved people enough, and we should involve people, and let's at least say that these things are for people, for members of the community. We'll get the community involved. And the whole idea of the smart citizen was, okay, let's just get people involved, and as long as we've done that, we're kind of tick the box. There's been a number of initiatives, but perhaps one of the most well-known at the moment is Sidewalk Toronto, where are people familiar with Sidewalk Toronto? Okay, good. So in Sidewalk Toronto, Sidewalk Labs is Google's kind of smart city division, if you like. They won the RFP to do the smart city neighborhood in Toronto, and from the very start, people in Toronto and elsewhere were saying, hold on a second, what is going to happen with our data? Why is Google getting involved in smart city? And Sidewalk Labs' response to this largely was, don't worry, we've got you covered. We'll have these sort of monthly or quarterly meetings, and you can sort of see what we're getting involved with. They never really got into the question of governance. Actually, how does the community govern this, not just sort of tick a box and say, yes, I consent to give my data to you. They never answered that, and what we've seen actually just in the last couple of weeks, this is after a couple of years of kind of working on this, is that the Sidewalk Toronto proposition is starting to fall apart. It's basically turning into a bit of a real estate play with some technology add-on. And so the smart citizen approach has tended to have two kind of aspects to it. One is basically this idea of just paying lip service to communities. And the second is that it's almost always going to US companies, large technology companies, IBM, Cisco, Google, et cetera, and effectively involving cities in long-term contracts for IoT or data platform kind of initiatives. And so this has led many cities to start to say, we cannot afford to sort of invest anymore in technological propositions because they don't turn into anything. You get broadband. Okay, that's my smart city initiative. That was Glasgow's play. Future City Glasgow it was called, and what they got was broadband. Which is nothing to sniff at, but it wasn't really how they won the money in the first place. So what we've started seeing is cities and towns starting to say, okay, what is the actual impact any of this is going to have? How do I own the outcome rather than a company in Silicon Valley? And how do we actually prioritize the actual context and the place and the specificity of this kind of hyper-local set of conditions. And so the thing that we at Umbrellium have started talking about is engaged cities for a number of reasons. One is that actually city managers tend to say the one thing above all they'd love to have is just this more engagement, people more involved throughout the whole process. And they see that as important, not just because it's really nice to get people involved, but because it just de-risks the whole process. You don't find that you've kind of spent 100 million on something and then nobody actually wanted it at the end. So the idea of engagement is that it actually is tied directly to impact. The second thing is that actually, by doing that, people become, in a sense, a kind of an ambassador for something. And these kind of engagement metrics, unlike the notion of SMART, can be measured. They can be measured in many different ways. And there's lots of different metrics, whether you're purely talking about a digital metric, or whether you're talking about people visiting a place, or whether they're making a number of decisions, or whether they are, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of different ways to measure engagement and to compare and to improve, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about engaged cities today and how you kind of drive that sort of longer term involvement and ultimately, in a very pragmatic sense, trying to de-risk the process of urban innovation rather than just parachuting in a technological solution. So the question really is, because technology is really good at solving tightly defined problems, how can you actually use technology instead to embrace complexity and unpredictability and diversity, all these things that it's not really designed to do? Because if you're able to do that, then the other conversation you can have, both with, let's say, a city or a neighborhood, a council, is this question of risk. So when a city, when a local authority gets people involved from the very start in making decisions or even questioning the brief itself, and when they see that through to the end, that's a really risky process because they have no idea what comes out at the other end. But at the same time, they're unable to waste tax money. And so they have this idea embedded in their kind of way of thinking that we can't take a risk because then people are going to say, why did you waste all our money? Those two things need to be tied together. And it's a question of building up trust between a community and a local authority that's actually doing something to say, okay, if you take a risk and if you go along with us through this, and if you are actually part of this process in defining what the impact should be, we don't necessarily know exactly what that outcome is going to be, but the unexpectedness of it, coupled with the deep involvement that people has, is the benefit itself that comes out of it, if you see what I mean. And in fact, again, cities find this a very uncomfortable conversation because they're not typically set up to take risk. But so many of them now have this driver of innovation. You know, there's innovation funding, the word innovation is used, and again, it's a bit like SMART. It doesn't really mean anything, but I'm willing to take it just because it sort of cuts out a bit of a conversation. And when you explain that there is no way to do innovation unless you're taking risk, then this process of getting people involved actually just de-risks that innovation, if you see what I mean. And that's largely the conversation that we try and have with local authorities or these kind of partners. So when you take this kind of holistic approach, and I'm hoping to kind of demonstrate some of this in some projects in a second, actually the one thing that technology, one of the best outcomes of it is not about the efficiency metrics or the optimization. It's about connecting people together to do something that they wouldn't have otherwise. And in my book, I would value just connecting people together to make even the most trivial decision simply because it creates a connection that wasn't there before and that typically lasts. And you don't necessarily know what that's going to lead to. So in many cases, we might start a project where people might be involved with the simplest of conversations or decisions, but they're starting to have them with people that they wouldn't have, or they're connected to people that they're just not connected to. And when you do that, you get this kind of cascading of engagement, you get people kind of meaningfully involved, As they get involved, they have this kind of sense of responsibility for something because they were there from the beginning. And that is what ultimately leads to impact, because they were part of this process through it. They were part of defining what they wanted. They were part of the process of seeing things go wrong and seeing that when you start out with some assumptions, usually they're challenged along the way. And so this is the kind of thing that I want to show through a number of projects. So I'll start with engagement. And by engagement, you know, what I mean is just from the very start, is this sort of rubbing against my cheek a lot and giving you a bit of a bass drum? Okay. Okay, every now and then I hear this sort of scratch. So I'm talking here about active participation. I'm not just talking about somebody sort of waving in front of a piece of lobby art and seeing a digital screen responding to them. I'm talking about people kind of getting involved directly with the creation of something. So I'm going to kick off with, this is one of my oldest projects, which was done in Singapore. It was called Burble, where this was just one night. And in a sense, this is an example of one of those sort of engagements where they weren't making a big decision, but it was something that involved thousands of people. So I designed this sort of very simple modular system, carbon fiber with balloons. And the idea was that this was a Lego kit that was, if you like, that was put out in public space for members of the public to start to design and build and then control structures. And what they ended up doing basically was creating an 18-story structure that, even if it was only for one night, actually changed, you know, the skyline. And the idea was that they were part of the design process, they were part of the fabrication process, and then because all of these balloons have LEDs and sensors in them, they can actually change the color collectively of this huge structure. So this is an 18-story structure that at about 250 people can hold on to at one time. If they all let go, it would fly off, but they kind of had this sense of trust because it was their structure that they hold on to this thing. And the colors that kind of mix and meld through this are explicitly determined by how they assembled the patterns and molecules of balloons in the first place. So this is just a sort of, you know, as I said, this was one of my first projects where I started thinking about, okay, how can we do something where people are coming together to do something that, even if it's only for a short time, has an effect on the skyline of the city. More recently, we were brought into an urban development on the outskirts of Cambridge in England, and there was a new community, and we ended up focusing on one building, which was the school, Trumpington Community College. So we got involved before we'd even broken ground. But we were able to work with some of the students that were going to come into this building. They would be about sort of 12 when they came there, but we started working with them when they were 10. And this school was planned to have loads of sort of sustainability systems, solar panels, sensor systems, and what have you. And over time, what we developed as a brief, both with the teachers and with the incoming students, was this idea of creating something that kind of made them feel like the building was theirs, and that they had to make some decisions about it, that they were actually meaningfully involved in it. And one of the things that emerged very, very early on was this idea that there should be a school pet or a school mascot or something. I'm going to skip ahead 2 years of about sort of 20-odd workshops and prototypes with the students, but what we eventually ended up creating with the students was an augmented reality cat which is connected to all of the sensor systems in the building, into the building management system, into the sustainability systems. And the students know and understood, and they actually designed how this cat responds to and represents the weather data, the temperature, the energy usage, et cetera, et cetera. So they can read the status of the building in the size, the color, and the behavior, and all these kind of things. But what's most important is that when Cinder gets hungry, named by the students, she goes out on the network and appears on one student's laptop begging for food. And the student has to make a decision about how much to feed the cat, and they have to think about how much solar energy has been generated today, which generates cat food, and which means that they can make this decision about the resource allocation of the building in a kind of in a particular sense. So Cinder will be there, it should be there for sort of 20, 25 years. The physical manifestation might change, but our remit was to design something that would last that long. So Cinder is going to be changing over the years and over the seasons, and as students kind of pass off to the next year, this is about 3 years old now, they teach the next batch of students coming in how to make sense of Cinder and what have you. This is basically a replacement for, Siemens has a building management system add-on, which is just a bunch of bar graphs and pie charts about energy usage. This is supposed to be a representation of the building, but one where people are actually motivated to make a decision about it. Going to a slightly different scale, in Bradford, actually I was first approached around 2009. I was actually invited to do a lighting design scheme for the city centre, where this is in North England. It's a very vibrant town. It's not huge, but their city centre was this tangled mess of roads and pollution. And there was this plan to pedestrianize it and to create what was known as the Mirror Pool Park. And when I came onto the project, working with Arup, who'd spec'd a lot of technology for the space, it turned out they had all these plans for LEDs and lights and lasers and fountains and mist machines and a pond that would rise and weather stations and sensors and cameras and all this stuff, but no idea of what the relationship between all of these were. And so what our project ended up being was not a lighting design scheme, but rather a kind of an interaction engine for connecting all of these inputs to all of these outputs and building a framework where the city manager or the parks manager could rapidly design different interactive programs for different parts of the area, for different times of day, for different seasons, for theming it for different things. And so, for example, if you wanted to connect the camera system to the fountains, you could make all the fountains chase people as they walked around, or you could have you could plug in an MP3 player and have all the lights start to respond to the music. You could have the lasers follow people or run away from them or try and herd them. All of these could be designed by the city parks manager or somebody else kind of working with the system. And so in a sense, it was, do people use IFTTT? Do you know what I'm talking about? It's this little web service where you can kind of connect your photos to your Gmail, send you a text message when the weather is too, when the temperature is too hot. You can basically build your own programs if you like. We were trying to build a kind of an IFTTT, but for urban space. And it was essentially a way that the interaction in this public space is always different. You never find the same kind of interactive experience twice. Actually, probably after a while you will, but typically you'd have a very different experience and you wouldn't be able to predict what the space was doing. But coupled with the kind of the physical manifestation, and here are some of the lasers doing different things based on how the parks manager has configured it. Coupled with that, we built a kind of a software platform to actually do this connecting. And so it was partly a visualization tool, but also a kind of a configuration tool where you could sort of click and drag and drop sensors to outputs and things like that. And we're actually now working on a version where any member of the public using a mobile phone could start to build their own interactive programs. This is really actually the ultimate intention, would be that people can themselves start to configure some part of the public space the way they want to, or have it kind of respond to them in ways that they define rather than us. So this is quite a long journey from just being invited to do a lighting scheme to kind of doing basically, as I called it earlier, an operating system. So that was engagement. Getting people involved, it's ultimately then all about this kind of idea of responsibility. How do you actually encourage people or provide a means through which they can make decisions, that they can actually make meaningful decisions? And one of the projects where we've done this in many different ways, depending on the community, is a project called VoiceOver, which is a very simple set of apparatus, if you like. It started in East Durham, which is in North England. It was former coal mining territory. And one of the themes that emerged very early on in the project, this was a 3-year project, by the way, that emerged very early on in the project was this notion of voice. And people would repeatedly say, well, I don't feel like I have a voice in my community. And the second theme that would emerge would be people would say, you know, I actually don't really know everyone on my street like I used to 20 or 30 years ago. I no longer really have a need to go and knock on my neighbor's door. And so it'd be great if there was a project that, in a sense, would give me an excuse to do that. Again, I'm kind of fast-forwarding a lot of workshops and prototyping and things like that. What we ended up creating was basically a hyper-local social radio. And so this is a radio where every radio is connected to every other one, and where everyone can hear the conversations that go on. But it's up to the community to decide and to define how that radio is used and what content it is used for, and whether it's a purely broadcast mechanism, or is it just about small groups of people, or is it just about one person recording their own thoughts and then sharing them later. All of that is defined by the community. So there's a radio unit that you get, but there's also an antenna. So this goes on the outside of your home, and you can basically see the voices as they bounce in and out of people's homes. So you can see where your message is going, and everyone else can also see this. It's a bit uncomfortable in the age of, you know, concern about privacy and communication and what have you. But we explicitly wanted to make something that was radically public, where actually this was specifically for public conversations. And it was to drive that kind of public conversation. And the way it actually works is that these radios, they're based on a peer-to-peer network, which basically means if you want to get your message around the corner to a friend, then you're going to have to convince the person on the corner to be the node in between, because the voice translates. It's a bit like you know, the game as kids where you sort of whisper in the ear and it sort of gets passed along as a message. So it's almost like a metaphorical cup of sugar, an excuse for you to go to your neighbor and say, would you be part of this thing that looks really weird because you've seen all these lights bouncing around the neighborhood? Would you like to be part of it? Because if you do, then I can talk to my friend and you can become part of the network. So the way it's actually manifested in different communities has been quite different. So in East Durham, as you heard, it was used for kids would sort of tell knock-knock jokes. Some people would use it. People would use it, somebody actually used it to tell bedtime stories to the neighborhood. Others would use it to sort of talk about the old times, coal mining and things like that. When we took it to Finsbury Park, which is, it's in the middle of London, completely different context, we were actually working in a tower block, which was mostly, it was people who had immigrated to London. It was almost entirely people who weren't born and really didn't have much of a history in London. And one of the things that came out very early on was people would say things like, I've never actually spoken to my neighbor, but I've smelled their cooking and I'd love to have whatever they're making for dinner. And in this kind of implementation, it was used in a completely different way, which was defined by the community in conjunction with somebody who was identified as a kind of a steward for this, who would basically send out questions to the community and then get back about where they'd come from, their vision of London, you know, what they missed about home and things like that. And then she would issue a broadcast throughout the week, weaving together everyone's stories, kind of playing back to them. We then took it to Brighton in the south of Britain, where we worked with the trans and non-binary community, where actually there was a desire not to have anything on the outside of the building, but instead the system was actually, it was actually done as an art project by an artist called Emma Frankland, who curated a whole set of different conversations and performances and different ways for the community, her community, to make use of it. And then at a center of activism in the center of Brighton, there was this kind of banner that would light up every time somebody was talking, so that by the time this network had spread throughout Brighton, the whole thing was kind of animating all the time, but it wasn't tied to any one specific residence. On a different kind of context, we were thinking about the future of the street, or the near future of the street, rather. You know, we've got autonomous vehicles starting to inhabit our cities, just starting to. You know, companies like Tesla kind of like to beta test their features in the cities by rolling out self-driving. But it's going to take about 20 or 25 years until, in conservative estimates, until the streets are actually filled with autonomous vehicles. And my concern has been, well, what about pedestrians? Where do pedestrians fit into this? Because in theory, if the street is a river of self-driving vehicles, then you should be able to step out anywhere. But that's a really hard transition to make from where we are now, which is that we have this painted-on design that's been there for 50 years. And so we started thinking about shared space, which is this urban design approach to building roads that are also pavements where vehicles and public transportation and bicycles all share the same space. And there has been research that shows that this actually makes them more safe, not less safe. We started looking at all the kind of creative approaches to crossings that are now going on about how they're only painted on, but they're kind of they're more than just the white stripes. And we started thinking about how do you, in the near term, as a pedestrian, how can we redesign the street and particularly the crossing in such a way that it's responding to people rather than, and their desire lines and the way they use the street and the fact that the street changes from day to night or even during the course of the day when the school lets out, you might suddenly have loads of kids trying to cross the street. How can we actually design the street so that it responds to people, and most importantly, so that they can start to decide for themselves and define what the safest kind of trajectory is? And so we ended up basically creating this thing called the Starling Crossing, which is, it's a road surface where the markings in the pedestrian crossing are dynamic and responsive, and they basically learn from the desire lines of people trying to cross the street. So the idea is that the crossing will appear where people tend to want to cross, and it will adapt. Let's say late at night, if the cinema lets out, the crossing can get wider. When people are, if for example there's a cyclist who doesn't see pedestrians because there's a high-sided vehicle, it can show different markings. All of these are based on a visual language that we're kind of accustomed to, but we're kind of combining that with a design framework that's basically about drawing attention to other stuff, if you see what I mean. So one of the things our biggest challenge was not to just create a video game surface, if you see what I mean, where people wanted to jump into this. And so everything from the animation speed to the way that things get displayed is explicitly on drawing people's gaze or drawing people's eyes towards, whether they're drivers or pedestrians or cyclists, towards all the others that are sharing the space with them. And so this was an actual road, I should say. Sometimes people think it's a render, but this is a surface. It takes the weight of vehicles and vans, and it's waterproof, and it looks like a road until it lights up, and it works in sunlight and what have you. So we're working with a road infrastructure company now to turn this into a kind of more scalable proposition. So the last thing I want to talk about is kind of impact and particularly measurement. I'm going to talk about 3 different things. The first is Thingful. So now there are thousands of these data platforms around the world. There are thousands of different kind of IoT systems, and even if you just look at something like air quality, there are about 25 different networks that operate in London alone, generating sensor data, and most importantly, actually making it available to members of the public. It's almost always the stuff that I'm talking about here is open data, but they're all in their separate platform, and it's incredibly hard to find it. So we just kind of did something that seems a bit obvious in retrospect, which is that we just index all of these platforms, and then we convert the data format and the different protocols that the platforms use, and just make it possible for you to search for the data that you're actually looking for. So if you're looking for air quality, for example, it will show you all the different air quality sensors, no matter which network they're on, and give you a direct feed to that data. And so on top of that, we're actually also creating this is for Singapore, we've got a bit of a kind of an experimentation platform where you can start to run experiments on that data. And even if you want to run an experiment in your own neighborhood on something that's being measured, in Japan, radiation has been a really significant thing, then you can do that with the data sources that are already available. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things that this led to in a second. But yes, so this is the experimentation platform. This is actually not live yet, but it's basically a way of gathering data streams, amassing the data from sources that have explicitly made it available, and then enabling you to sort of compare that data and sort of create visualizations around it to try and make sense of it. But where this all kind of starts to make sense is in a project that's called GROW. We're part of a consortium across the EU working on soil monitoring. So there are satellites that measure soil quality across the planet, but it's very low resolution data. So in the GROW project, we're working with farmers and growers across the EU in different countries to basically put sensors in the ground, compare it to all the other data that's available, and then basically ground truth the satellite data. So it's the relatively inexpensive sensors that are in the ground, coupled with all the other data that's available, that actually makes the satellite data more valuable and helps to calibrate it. And actually, in a kind of a virtuous cycle, the farmers who are basically giving their data to the satellite providers are then able to kind of feed back wider information about the farm's agricultural context, more about how their farm compares to other farms. And it's actually about this almost like a data economy, if you like, where the growers are improving their growing practices, and ultimately actually underpinning all of this is contributing to tackling climate change, because soil is a really important part of dealing with climate change. Again, shifting context totally, we do a lot of work with air quality. And so here, we've done a project called Pollution Explorers. This has actually been done now in quite a few cities. In this case, it was with some kids in East London. And the idea is actually for people to use their own senses to assess the air quality. So rather than having a digital sensor, we started out this project with the hypothesis that people probably know what the air quality is almost as well as a digital sensor, which a lot of cities are spending a lot of money to deploy. And what we found was actually that by going out in these kind of safaris, if you like, to go and find and use perception to assess air quality. We also took along with us a very highly calibrated, expensive air quality monitor. And we found that people had a sort of an 80% accuracy. In other words, people are able intuitively to understand what the air quality is, almost to the same degree that an air quality sensor does. But the most important part of this was not just acquiring this data or discovering that actually it's common sense what the air quality is, but rather that by going through this process and by basically making a public statement, the whole idea of the wearables was that we were actually tracking people's gestures as they responded to the air quality and then comparing those gestures and almost making a bit of a mini protest, if you like. You know, if you see a bunch of students, young kids on a street corner holding their noses like this, it actually has a visual effect. What we showed was that by coupling this process of people basically realizing that they could do as well as a sensor, that they did understand and could make sense of air quality, we showed that their commitment to actually changing behavior was much higher than if they'd not been involved in that process. In other words, if you want to get people involved in tackling something like air quality, we showed that there's a 90% success rate when you actually get them involved in a physical way in going out and making sense of their own neighborhood. It's not enough just to say, stop driving, you'll solve air quality, boom. No, you actually get people to have the debate and the discussion and go out into the street and really deliberate around the air quality issues. And so we use a number of different ways to get feedback actually from people on how they were either committing to something, or in some cases doing, in some cases not doing something, or changing their mind about what they wanted to do, whether it was taking more public transport. Somebody stopped eating hamburgers, which, by the way, in the long term, eating less meat will have a big impact on air quality. And I'm just going to wrap up with the Urban Innovation Toolkit, which is, it's basically it's a kind of a workshop and conversation framework that we developed after many years of doing these kind of quite complex projects, where we kind of noticed that anytime you get involved in urban innovation, there are these 5 things that almost seem so obvious that they get forgotten. And it starts with problems. Like, actually defining what the problem is almost always taken for granted in a technology or urban innovation project. But it has to be the thing that's at the core of anything you do. So we start with a bunch of questions, and typically this is done with a workshop of 10 to 15 people. Sometimes it might be local authority, or it might be specific teams, or it might be a technology provider, or it might be a group of all these, or it might be different project leaders. And we look at, okay, what do you think the problem is? And what do you think the problem is? And what do you think the problem is? And that's the first stage. We start to look at the stakeholders. And most importantly, the question is, which stakeholders have we forgotten about? And who can we ask to make sure we haven't forgotten other stakeholders? We start to look at the methods. That's the third thing. We look at the methods, and we start to track how these methods relate to specific stakeholders, specific problems. And then we look at evidence. What evidence is out there? What evidence do we need? What evidence do we need in order to convince somebody who is a decision maker that this thing is worth doing? And then finally, impact. And this is almost, brings everything else together. The conversation around impact is all about who gets to decide what the impact is, how do you measure it, and what happens if you don't achieve that? What are you going to do? And when we do this as a workshop, and this framework, by the way, is actually, it's more of our notepad for going through that conversation than really for the participants themselves. We go through that once. That takes minimum of 2 hours. And then we go around that again 5 times. And we go deeper and deeper and deeper into these questions of problems and stakeholders, methods, evidence, impact. And almost without fail, by the time a group of people has kind of gone through this, they discover that the thing they all thought they were talking about was the same thing actually is something completely different. In the best situations, we've kind of used this basically just to build a shared perspective among a bunch of different members of a team. In one case, we actually did this on an air quality project, and in a sense, this is one of my proudest moments. We went through this project and convinced them not to do the project because all of the assumptions that the different team members were taking on for this, it was going to be a citywide deployment of sensors. All of the assumptions that they had turned out to be faulty. And one of the most interesting things was that the greatest cost of the air quality project was going to be the deployment of the sensors, attaching them to lampposts. And that provider, the provider who would be actually doing that, mounting sensors onto lampposts, which is a costly thing, wasn't even involved in the project. There was this kind of assumption that we'll just find somebody to do that. And so, in a sense, the whole idea of this Urban Innovation Toolkit is to, if you like, it's not to remove the risk, but to identify the uncertainty and the complexity and really make sure that the people who are carrying out the project are able to explain to others why they're doing the project, what impact it's going to have, and how to assess that as they go along, and make sure there's a sort of a well-understood vocabulary for that throughout the project. So, just to summarize, This idea of technology, again, not as an object, but as a set of processes, for me, it's most important to use it to get people doing something that they weren't already doing. To connect them together so that they are having conversations, so that they are ideally making decisions, so that they are ideally actually kind of filled with a sense of agency and accomplishment that they've actually done something. And so we talk about engagement, this idea of getting them actively involved, not just sort of things reacting to them, but where they're actually part of the design and development and deployment process. We talk about responsibility, getting people involved in making those meaningful decisions, not just choosing A or B, which is the kind of 1960s model of community consultation, but how are they going to make the decisions? How can they even make the decisions about what decisions need to be made, if you see what I mean? Because that's actually a really interesting thing. When you ask a community or a group of stakeholders right at the beginning of the project, is this even the right goal? Or, is this question we're asking you, is this even the right question to ask you? It invariably leads the conversation into territory that is completely unexpected, but which helps them become these kind of ambassadors for the project, because they really feel like they were part of the governance of it. And then finally, thinking about impact. If you're going to do something, if you're going to invest in it, if you're going to, basically involve lots of people and lots of time and energy, how are you going to measure it? And then how are you going to scale it? That doesn't mean scale it globally, but how does it actually scale up from the people initially involved in it to people that will be involved in it on a longer term basis, or that might be there in the next generation or what have you. And with that, I say thank you very much. And